I've included a link in the description to a free download of a CMF file, which includes all of my buttons and menus, which you can put on an SD card and then register with your own C70. However, everyone has their own shooting style, and whatever's best for me might not be best for you. So I assume it's more likely throughout the course of this video, you might just stumble upon one or two programmable buttons that you might want to implement into your own custom setup. Starting with buttons 1 and 2, I have them set aside for slow and fast mode. Number 1 changes the frame rate, and number 2 enables slow and fast mode. As I've covered in its own unique video, the C70 limits your autofocus functions when in slow and fast mode. So if you're not shooting 120, it's preferable to shoot 60, not in slow and fast mode, and then slow it down in post. If you do that, like I always do, once you do want to go back to slow and fast mode for 120, you're going to end up with 24/24, and slow and fast mode will be utterly useless. So if you program the button above slow and fast mode to be frame rate, problem solved. Or at least problem made much easier to solve when it arises. 3, I keep peaking. I love peaking. Number 4, record. Waveform is more useful to me elsewhere, and this button is already red, so it just makes sense to be a left operator side of camera record option. Canon expected people to do this, so there's actually a separate option in the function menu just for turning button 4 into the record button. And when you do that, it'll gray out number 4 in the assignable button menu because you already assigned it through the function menu thing that does just this. Number 5, displays. I'm constantly cycling through the full screen display when I'm composing a shot, and then usually when I'm filming, especially during an interview, I have all my displays on so I can double check and triple check my focus and frame rates and all the other settings that you see on the borders. Number 6, zebras. If you're more interested in this, you can check out the video I did on properly exposing C-Log 2. I dive into why I started using zebras very recently to expose skin. A quick note before we spin the camera around, I'm making this video because it's probably by far the most requested video topic I get in the comments. I'm also working on a video on the 5 most common questions I get about the C70, so subscribe if that's something that you're into. Number 7, false color. I love to use this to check for blown highlights. 8, magnification. You just gotta get that critical focus the old-fashioned way sometimes. Number 9, waveform. This is probably my most used custom button because almost every time I set up a shot, I don't want the waveform there when composing it because it's kind of distracting and you can't move it, but I do want it there when setting my exposure. 10, the frame rate menu. As I mentioned earlier, you lose critical autofocus functionality like face tracking and object tracking when in slow and fast mode, aka slow motion in camera. And this button allows me to quickly switch to 60 frames, not slow and fast mode. I think this is my only custom button that actually goes to a specific part of the menu versus changing something when the button is pushed. But as far as I know, there isn't a way to assign a button to just switch the frame rate automatically. And now these 2 guys under the lens mount in front, 11 and 12. I use these to toggle autofocus and face tracking autofocus on and off. I essentially always have autofocus and face tracking autofocus on, but if there's no face in frame or object that I'm trying to track, I'll toggle off 11 and just use regular autofocus. And then I use 12 as a kill switch if the C70 fucks everything up and can't get focused on anything, which especially happens in low light. And I'll manually adjust the lens, and then I'll toggle them back on if I think conditions have changed to an extent where I can trust the autofocus again. I recently operated on someone else's C70 for a shoot, and these were the 2 assignable buttons that I changed right away. I'm hitting those 2 just as often as any other setting. And it's become integral to my shooting style because you cannot trust the autofocus on this camera in a lot of situations, but I can't live without it in the situations where it does work. If you're a manual lens type of guy or gal, then you can probably ignore a good chunk of my button selections, especially these 2. Lastly, number 13, audio status, just as Canon intended. Recently on a shoot, I had a sound guy who had never seen a C70 before, but while I was doing something else across the room, he was able to navigate the camera without any assistance from me. I do really like this intuitive setup they have hidden behind the LCD. It would be nice if channels 3 and 4 also had dials to control the gain, so you don't have to dig into the menus, and I think that's a great segue to the My Menu settings. These menus are for just those types of settings where you want to use something maybe once or twice a shoot, but it's not worth the precious real estate of a assignable button. And I'm sorry for the distracting angle of my screen. Yes, the LCD is a tad f***ed, but I'm not talking about that here. That's a conversation for another video. Currently in my menus, I have things like my extended ND range, digital IS, switching autofocus modes, which I don't do too often, the focus guide, LCD illuminance, in case I really need to save battery, and grid markers, which has become more important for me when trying to get level shots with an LCD that looks like mine does. Setting up these menus is super simple. Just hit edit, register, and then it shows you the entire C70 menu. You can select any setting in there, hit OK, and it will be added to your list. As I mentioned, adjusting audio levels for channels 3 and 4 is something you have to go into the menus for, so I set my menu number 2 to be all of those audio settings. Again, the free download to all of my settings and assignable buttons are in the description below. My assignable button setup has been changing daily since I got this camera and will probably continue to evolve, especially if new firmware updates come and make some of these things not as important or redundant. But as of October 2021, this is what I found to be most helpful. And that's the way the cookie crumbles.
I'm Bruce Nolan, Eyewitness News.